1944, before sunrise, when the order was given at a moment when American air support could no longer be assumed, when radios crackled with uncertainty, and the horizon itself seemed to shift from promise to threat, and the small escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3, known to history as Taffy 3, were already moving into the wind east of Samar Island, unaware that the largest surface force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy was closing fast through the morning haze, because in those first minutes of October 25, the war in the Pacific compressed itself into a narrow strip of sea and time, where decisions made without full information would determine survival or destruction, and where American commanders would be forced to act as if no help was coming, because at that moment it might not. The escort carriers were doing exactly what they had been ordered to do the day before, flying continuous close air support missions for American troops landing on Leyte, launching slow, lightly armed FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers from flight decks never designed to operate under direct enemy surface threat, while destroyers and destroyer escorts formed a thin, almost symbolic screen against submarines and aircraft, not battleships and heavy cruisers, because the American assumption, shared by Admiral William F. Halsey and the planners of the invasion, was that the Japanese surface fleet had already been broken or driven off, that whatever remained would not risk a direct daylight engagement against American carriers, even escort carriers. But assumptions had already begun to collapse in the darkness to the west, where Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had survived air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea and had continued east through San Bernardino Strait under cover of night, emerging into the Philippine Sea at precisely the place where the American screen was weakest. And as the sky began to lighten, American radar operators aboard the small carriers picked up contacts that did not fit the expected pattern of friendly aircraft or distant land returns, contacts that were closing fast and growing in number, and when visual confirmation followed, it was not aircraft that appeared on the horizon, but the tall pagoda masts and heavy silhouettes of Japanese battleships and cruisers, including ships larger and more heavily armed than anything the men of Taffy 3 had ever faced. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, was confronted in seconds with a reality that defied the operational logic of the invasion, because the Japanese force in front of him was not a raiding element or a token attack, but a full battle line that included the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, and heavy cruisers whose guns outranged anything Sprague had at his disposal by many miles. And as shells began to fall into the water around the American formation, the scale of the danger became immediately clear, because there was no time to withdraw in good order, no room to maneuver without exposing the carrier's unarmored sides, and no certainty that friendly fast carriers or battleships were anywhere close enough to intervene. The first Japanese salvos landed short, but close enough to send towering columns of water over the decks of the carriers, and as range was corrected with alarming speed, the thin margin between survival and annihilation narrowed to seconds, forcing Sprague to issue orders that were not part of any rehearsed plan, because the plan had never envisioned this situation. And as he ordered his carriers to turn east and south, away from the enemy, increasing speed to their maximum of barely 18 knots, he also ordered all available aircraft launched immediately, regardless of fuel state or ordnance, because the flight decks were about to become killing zones, and planes sitting idle were planes that would be destroyed before they could ever fight. Wildcats and Avengers were shoved off the decks in rapid succession, some carrying depth charges, some carrying half-empty fuel tanks, some carrying nothing at all, because there was no time to rearm or refuel, and once airborne, they were ordered to attack the Japanese force by any means available, not because such attacks were expected to stop battleships, but because delay itself was now a weapon. Because every minute bought by confusion, smoke, or misidentification increased the chance that Taffy 3 might survive long enough for help to arrive. The American destroyers USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Heermann, along with destroyer escorts like USS Samuel B. Roberts, were ordered to make smoke and then attack, an order that placed them directly in the path of an enemy force whose main batteries could destroy them with a single hit. But the alternative, remaining between the enemy and the carriers without action, offered no survival at all. And so these ships turned toward the Japanese line, increasing speed, laying smoke, and preparing to launch torpedoes at ranges that would have been considered suicidal under normal conditions, but normal conditions no longer applied. Sprague's situation was made worse by the knowledge that air support, the one factor that might have balanced the disparity in surface firepower, was now deeply uncertain because the aircraft launching from his decks were not part of a coordinated strike, were not guided by centralized control, and were operating at the very edge of their endurance, while the fast carrier task forces that should have been able to provide decisive air power were hundreds of miles away to the north, pursuing what they believed to be the main Japanese carrier force. And even if those carriers turned south immediately, hours would pass before the aircraft could intervene, hours that Taffy 3 did not have. As Japanese shells began to land among the carriers, damaging USS Callinan Bay and USS White Plains, and near missing USS Fanshawe Bay itself, the order to abandon any pretense of formation discipline was given, and each carrier maneuvered independently, zigzagging through smoke and spray in an attempt to throw off Japanese gunfire, while pilots overhead reported the size and composition of the enemy force in increasingly urgent terms, confirming what Sprague already knew, that this was not a skirmish but a full-scale surface engagement in which his command was drastically outmatched. The Japanese, for their part, were initially uncertain of what they were facing, because the sight of aircraft overhead and the presence of multiple carriers led Kurita and his subordinates to believe they had stumbled upon elements of the American fast carrier force, a misidentification that would have profound consequences. But at this moment, that uncertainty worked in the Americans' favor only to a limited degree, because regardless of what Kurita believed, his ships continued to fire, and the shells continued to fall closer. As the destroyers closed to launch torpedoes, taking hits that shattered superstructures and disabled guns, the escorts pressed on, because turning away would expose the carriers behind them, and the cost of hesitation was immediate, measured in splintered steel and rising smoke columns, and through it all, Sprague continued to issue orders that balanced aggression with survival, directing smoke screens, vectoring aircraft, and attempting to communicate with higher command, even as radio circuits were overloaded and fragmented, because many other units were now reporting contact, confusion, and crisis across the wider battlefield. One of the most critical uncertainties was whether any American air support beyond what Taffy 3 could generate itself would arrive in time, because the aircraft now attacking the Japanese force were doing so piecemeal, diving through intense anti-aircraft fire to drop whatever they carried, often without achieving direct hits, but forcing Japanese ships to maneuver, breaking formation, and complicating fire control, and in several cases causing cruisers to turn away after taking torpedo damage or near misses that suggested heavier attacks were imminent. And yet, these effects were temporary, because the Japanese force still possessed overwhelming firepower and numerical superiority, and as the range closed further, the possibility that the carriers would be overtaken became increasingly real. Sprague's order to his destroyers to attack was followed by another, equally stark directive, to the pilots overhead that they were to continue attacks until out of ammunition or fuel and then proceed to any available airfield, because returning to the carriers might no longer be possible, an acknowledgement that the decks they had launched from might soon be burning wrecks or sunk beneath the sea. And this recognition that there might be no safe return route hung over every decision made in the next minutes, shaping actions not by hope of victory, but by the need to impose delay and uncertainty on an enemy whose momentum had to be broken or at least slowed. As Japanese shells finally found their mark with devastating accuracy, striking USS Gambier Bay and reducing her speed, the consequences of the morning's miscalculations became undeniable, because now the escort carriers were being destroyed in sequence, and the thin screen of destroyers was paying for every minute of delay with lives and ships. And yet the Japanese advance still faltered not because it lacked power, but because it lacked clarity. Because Kurita was still trying to understand what he was facing, still reacting to air attacks that suggested a much larger American presence, and still weighing whether pressing the attack would expose his force to annihilation by American air power he believed must be nearby. In this narrow window, with smoke covering the sea, aircraft darting in and out of cloud, and ships maneuvering at close quarters under fire, the order that defined the battle had already been given. The order to fight without certainty of air support, to act as if no reinforcement would arrive, because waiting for confirmation would mean waiting too long. And as Sprague's carriers continued to flee eastward under fire, and as his destroyers and pilots continued to attack against impossible odds, the outcome of the morning remained completely unresolved, hanging on the next decisions made by commanders on both sides who were operating on fragmentary information. Because in October 1944, at the Battle off Samar, the fate of Taffy 3 and the meaning of American naval power in the Pacific would be decided not by grand strategy, but by what happened next as the Japanese guns kept firing and the American carriers kept running, and the question of whether help would arrive in time remained unanswered. And as the Japanese guns kept firing and the American carriers kept running, and the question of whether help would arrive in time remained unanswered, the pressure on every ship and every commander intensified minute by minute as the battle widened and the strain began to fracture both formations. Because once the initial shock passed, there was no pause, no reset, and no chance to step back and reassess. Only a continuous sequence of reactions driven by speed, smoke, and fear of being overtaken. The escort carriers continued their desperate flight to the east and southeast, turning into squalls when they could, laying smoke where possible. But their limited speed meant that even small navigational errors could be fatal, and every time a carrier slowed to launch or recover aircraft, it risked falling behind, becoming the next target singled out by Japanese gunners, who were now firing with greater confidence as the range closed. USS Gambier Bay, already damaged and losing speed, began to lag visibly behind the rest of the formation, her engineering plant struggling to maintain pressure after near misses and splinter damage. And the Japanese heavy cruisers, sensing opportunity, shifted fire toward her, walking shells closer with each salvo until hits began to register, reducing her ability to maneuver and forcing her escorts to place themselves between her and the enemy, an act that exposed them directly to fire they could not withstand for long. At the same time, Japanese destroyers surged forward through the smoke in an attempt to launch torpedoes at the fleeing carriers, forcing American escorts to break off attacks against battleships and cruisers to counter this new threat, because a single successful torpedo spread against the carriers could end the battle instantly, and this constant shifting of priorities added to the confusion and exhaustion already gripping both sides. Overhead, American aircraft continued to attack in ones and twos, diving from cloud cover or emerging suddenly from smoke banks to release bombs or torpedoes, many of which failed to hit but still forced Japanese ships into sharp evasive maneuvers that disrupted their firing solutions, while Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the air with black bursts and tracers, creating an environment in which pilots often lost sight of both targets and friendly ships. And several American planes were damaged or forced to ditch after exhausting their fuel, splashing down in waters that were still under enemy gunfire. The lack of centralized air control meant that these attacks were uncoordinated and often redundant, yet the cumulative effect was significant because Japanese commanders could not determine how many carriers were launching these strikes, nor from where, reinforcing the belief that a larger American force was nearby. And this uncertainty began to influence Kurita's decisions, even as his ships continued to press the attack. Aboard USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Sprague faced the compounding problem of communications because radio circuits were saturated, messages overlapped or went unheard, and reports from other units arrived fragmentary and delayed, making it difficult to form a coherent picture of the broader situation, while at the same time, damage reports from his own ships demanded immediate attention, forcing him to prioritize survival over coordination. As the battle stretched on, ammunition stocks on the destroyers and destroyer escorts began to dwindle, particularly torpedoes, which were fired at ranges far shorter than doctrine recommended, often without time for careful targeting, because the goal was no longer precise destruction, but disruption, forcing Japanese ships to turn away even briefly, and each turn bought seconds and minutes that allowed the carriers to open the distance slightly, though never enough to feel safe. USS Johnston, already badly damaged from earlier hits, continued to fight, maneuvering aggressively despite reduced speed and flooding, while USS Hoyle pressed attacks that brought her dangerously close to the Japanese line, absorbing hits that knocked out guns and communications but did not immediately stop her advance. And USS Samuel B. Roberts, smaller and more lightly built than the destroyers, charged forward at flank speed to engage heavy cruisers, firing her 5-inch guns as rapidly as possible despite the obvious mismatch, an action driven not by expectation of survival, but by the necessity of preventing the enemy from focusing exclusively on the carriers. As these surface engagements unfolded, Japanese gunners began to adjust their fire more effectively, with salvos landing closer and more frequently among the American ships. And the water around Taffy 3 became a chaotic field of splashes, smoke, debris, and oil, reducing visibility to such an extent that ships sometimes lost sight of one another entirely, increasing the risk of collision or isolation. It was during this phase that USS Gambier Bay suffered additional hits that further reduced her speed and compromised her ability to generate steam, making her the slowest ship in the formation by a significant margin. And as she fell back, Japanese cruisers shifted focus to finish her off, while Sprague ordered other carriers to continue their escape rather than slow to protect her, a decision that reflected the brutal arithmetic of survival under fire, because attempting to save one ship at the expense of all would achieve nothing. Meanwhile, reports began to filter in that American aircraft from other escort carrier groups to the south were beginning to join the fight, drawn by distress calls and visual contact, adding to the confusion over how much air power the Americans could bring to bear. And though these aircraft were also lightly armed and operating at the edge of their range, their presence further complicated Japanese assessments, suggesting that the engagement zone was expanding and that the risk of counterattack from unseen carriers was growing. Kurita, observing the persistent air attacks, the aggressive behavior of American escorts, and the apparent presence of multiple carrier groups, began to question whether pressing the attack was wise, particularly given his orders to preserve the fleet for decisive action and the losses his force had already sustained earlier in the campaign. And yet, the opportunity to destroy American carriers lay directly ahead, tempting him to continue despite the growing uncertainty. This internal conflict within the Japanese command structure played out in hesitations and course changes that were subtle but consequential, as some ships pressed forward while others maneuvered defensively, disrupting formation cohesion and reducing the effectiveness of concentrated fire, which in turn allowed more American ships to escape immediate destruction. As the minutes stretched into an hour, exhaustion began to take its toll on American crews, who had been at general quarters since before dawn, operating under constant threat of shell fire and air attack, dealing with casualties, flooding, fires, and mechanical failures without relief, while also maintaining maximum speed and executing sharp turns that strained both machinery and nerves. And this cumulative fatigue increased their risk of mistakes that could prove fatal. On the Japanese side, crews were also under strain, having been at battle stations for extended periods, maneuvering at high speed, and responding to repeated air attacks that required constant vigilance. And the lack of clear situational awareness added psychological pressure, because commanders could not be certain whether the enemy force in front of them was all that existed or merely a fragment of something much larger. As USS Gambier Bay continued to absorb punishment, eventually losing power and becoming a stationary target, Japanese fire intensified against her, and she began to list, her fate becoming increasingly clear to those watching from nearby ships. Yet even as she was being destroyed, the rest of the carriers continued to escape, a grim trade-off that underscored the desperate nature of the battle and the impossibility of saving everyone. At the same time, Japanese destroyers launched torpedo attacks that forced American carriers to maneuver sharply, breaking smoke cover and exposing themselves briefly to renewed gunfire. And each such maneuver risked further damage or collision, particularly as visibility remained poor and ships were scattered over a wide area. Sprague continued to issue orders that prioritized dispersion, smoke, and evasive action, knowing that concentration would only make targeting easier for the enemy, and he repeatedly requested support from higher command, though he could not know whether those requests were being received or acted upon, because the radio traffic was overwhelming and the broader operational picture was still confused. As additional American aircraft joined the fight, including planes from Taffy 2 and land-based aircraft from Leyte, the air above the Japanese force became increasingly crowded, further reinforcing the impression that the Americans could bring sustained air power to bear, even though many of these planes were operating on fumes and would soon be forced to withdraw. And this illusion of strength played a crucial role in shaping Japanese perceptions at a moment when decisive clarity was lacking. Kurita's flagship maneuvered to avoid torpedoes and bombs, and reports of damage and losses filtered in from his cruisers, some of which had been hit hard enough to reduce speed or require withdrawal. And this erosion of combat power, combined with the unexpected ferocity of American resistance, began to shift the balance of risk in Kurita's calculations, even as the American carriers remained under immediate threat. As USS Johnston and USS Hull took on fatal damage, and USS Samuel B. Roberts continued to fight until she too was critically hit, the cost of delaying the Japanese advance mounted. But so too did the distance between the enemy and the carriers that were still operational. And this widening gap, measured in thousands of yards and seconds of time, represented the fragile margin on which survival now depended. The battle, which had begun as a sudden ambush, had evolved into a running engagement marked by smoke, scattered contacts, and competing imperatives, with neither side fully in control of events, and the Kurita weighed whether to continue pursuit or disengage to avoid potential annihilation by unseen American forces. Sprague could only continue to flee, launch aircraft, and sacrifice escorts to buy time, because at this stage there was no decisive action left to take, only endurance under fire, and hope that the enemy's uncertainty would outweigh his firepower. As the Japanese line hesitated and began to show signs of fragmentation, with some ships turning north or west while others continued east, the battle reached a moment of precarious balance, because a renewed coordinated push by the Japanese could still overtake and destroy the remaining carriers, while a decision to break off would leave them battered but alive. And it was in this narrow window, with smoke thinning and the sea littered with wreckage, that the outcome of the morning still hung unresolved, as the strain on both sides reached a breaking point, and the next orders issued by Japanese command would determine whether the fight continued toward total destruction or began to slip, uncertainly, toward disengagement. As the strain on both sides reached a breaking point, and the next orders issued by Japanese command would determine whether the fight continued toward total destruction or began to slip, uncertainly, toward disengagement, the battle entered its most dangerous phase, the moment when collapse was closest and survival was least certain, because neither side yet knew that the balance had already begun to tilt, invisibly, through accumulated hesitation and loss. The American formation was now widely scattered, no longer resembling a task unit but a loose collection of fleeing carriers, wounded escorts, drifting smoke screens, and burning wrecks. And this dispersion, while dangerous, also made it harder for Japanese gunners to concentrate fire, forcing them to choose individual targets rather than annihilate the group as a whole. USS Gambier Bay, immobilized and taking heavy fire, continued to draw attention, and Japanese cruisers closed to finish her, their shells striking with devastating effect as she slowed to a near stop, listing heavily and losing all ability to fight back. Yet even in her final minutes, she absorbed fire that might otherwise have been directed at carriers still capable of escape, and her destruction, though inevitable, bought time measured in the only currency that mattered now. Elsewhere, USS Kalinin Bay and USS White Plains narrowly avoided fatal hits through constant maneuver, their captains ordering hard rudder turns at the last possible moments as shell splashes bracketed their hulls. And the stress on crews operating engines at maximum output without pause began to manifest in mechanical failures, overheating machinery, and momentary losses of power that could have spelt instant destruction had Japanese ships been closer or more coordinated. Overhead, the air battle intensified even as fuel dwindled, with American pilots continuing to make repeated attack runs despite depleted ammunition, because breaking off entirely would leave the surface ships exposed, and some pilots resorted to simulated attacks, diving toward Japanese ships without releasing ordnance, pulling up at the last moment to force evasive maneuvers, a tactic born of desperation but effective in maintaining the illusion of relentless air assault. Japanese anti-aircraft fire continued to fill the sky, and though it claimed relatively few American aircraft outright, it contributed to the chaos by forcing pilots to maneuver unpredictably, sometimes crossing paths with one another or losing visual contact with both targets and escape routes. And several planes ran out of fuel and ditched, their crews entering water still contested and dangerous, dependent on rescue that might not come for hours. On the surface, USS Johnston, already shattered by multiple hits, fought on at reduced speed, her remaining guns firing whenever targets appeared through smoke, and her presence alone, battered but unyielding, continued to suggest to Japanese observers that American resistance was far stronger than expected, reinforcing doubts about the wisdom of continued pursuit. USS Heermann, having expended her torpedoes, maneuvered aggressively to draw fire and disrupt Japanese formations, placing herself repeatedly between enemy ships and the carriers, while USS Howell, mortally damaged, slowed, and eventually fell out of the fight, her sacrifice complete but unheralded in the moment, because there was no time to acknowledge loss, only to survive the next minute. USS Samuel B. Roberts, hit repeatedly and flooding rapidly, continued firing until her guns were knocked out and power failed, her brief, violent engagement leaving an outsized impression on the Japanese cruisers she had challenged, contributing further to the perception that American escort forces were unusually aggressive and capable. As these escorts were destroyed or disabled one by one, the American carriers faced a stark reality that their protective screen was thinning to nothing, and any renewed Japanese push could reach them directly, unopposed by surface combatants, making the next decisions by Kurita's force absolutely decisive. On the Japanese side, reports of damage accumulated, including cruisers slowed or forced to withdraw after torpedo hits or near misses, and the loss of cohesion within the formation became increasingly apparent, as ships maneuvered independently to avoid air attacks, smoke, and torpedoes, breaking the line and reducing the ability to bring concentrated fire to bear, a critical factor given the already limited visibility. Kurita himself struggled to maintain situational awareness, receiving conflicting reports about the number and type of American carriers engaged, the scale of air attacks, and the disposition of his own ships. And without clear intelligence, every choice carried enormous risk, because pressing the attack might lead to catastrophic losses if American fast carriers appeared suddenly, while breaking off might forfeit a rare opportunity to destroy vulnerable enemy carriers and strike a blow at the heart of the Leyte invasion. This uncertainty was amplified by the knowledge that his force had already suffered significant losses earlier in the campaign, that fuel reserves were limited, and that the preservation of remaining capital ships was a strategic imperative, all of which weighed heavily as he observed the persistent, if individually ineffective, American air attacks that showed no sign of diminishing. From the American perspective, Rear Admiral Sprague remained unaware of the internal deliberations taking place aboard the Japanese flagship and could not assume that hesitation would continue, because a single decisive order from Kurita could reverse the situation instantly, sending battleships and cruisers surging forward to overtake the carriers, whose speed advantage was marginal at best. Sprague therefore continued to act as if destruction was imminent, ordering continued evasive maneuvers, smoke deployment, and aircraft launches whenever possible, even as flight decks were damaged and cluttered, and as crews worked under constant threat of shell fire to keep operations going. The physical and mental exhaustion of American sailors reached critical levels, with men having been at battle stations for hours without relief, performing complex tasks under fire, dealing with casualties and damage while maintaining situational awareness in an environment where a moment's lapse could prove fatal. And yet, discipline held, orders were executed, and ships continued to maneuver with remarkable precision given the circumstances. The Japanese pursuit, meanwhile, began to lose momentum not through a single dramatic event, but through cumulative friction, as repeated course changes, evasive maneuvers, and the need to respond to air attacks gradually stretched the formation, reducing average speed and increasing the distance to the fleeing carriers, a subtle shift that was not immediately obvious to either side, but which gradually altered the geometry of the engagement. As smoke screens dissipated and visibility improved slightly, Japanese gunners found fewer clear targets, and American carriers began to open the range incrementally, enough to reduce the accuracy of heavy gunfire and increase the chance that near misses would remain just that, near misses rather than fatal hits. At the same time, reports began to reach Kurita that American aircraft were attacking Japanese forces elsewhere in the area, further complicating his assessment of the operational environment and suggesting that American air power was not confined to the immediate battle, a development that increased the perceived risk of continued engagement. For the Americans, the destruction of USS Gambier Bay marked the lowest point of the battle, the tangible loss of a carrier confirming that survival was not guaranteed and that the enemy was fully capable of killing them. And yet, even this loss did not break the formation's will, because by the time she sank, the remaining carriers had gained additional distance, and the Japanese pursuit showed signs of faltering. Overhead, American pilots continued to press attacks despite dwindling fuel, some making final runs knowing they would have to divert to distant airfields or ditch. And these final attacks, though limited in physical effect, maintained pressure on Japanese commanders, forcing them to continue defensive maneuvers at a moment when concentration and speed were essential to catching the carriers. As the battle approached its third hour, Kurita faced a narrowing set of options, because the longer he pursued, the greater the risk that American fast carriers or battleships would intervene, and the less likely it became that he could catch and destroy the escort carriers before they escaped into open water. And this growing imbalance between risk and reward brought the Japanese command to the edge of decision. For Sprague and his men, there was no awareness of this internal tipping point, only the relentless need to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep delaying, because any relaxation could allow the Japanese to regain the initiative, and so even as signs of reduced pressure appeared, they were treated with caution rather than optimism. The sea between the forces now contained the wreckage of multiple ships, drifting smoke, oil slicks, and debris, creating navigational hazards that further complicated pursuit and evasion alike. And the presence of survivors in the water, American and Japanese, underscored the human cost of the engagement, even as the battle itself remained unresolved. As Japanese ships began to turn away individually to avoid air attacks or regroup, the coherence of the pursuit weakened further, and the once clear direction of advance became muddled, with some ships continuing east while others turned north or west, creating gaps that American carriers exploited to increase distance. It was at this moment, with Japanese momentum visibly slowing and American escape becoming marginally more feasible, that the battle reached its most dangerous equilibrium, because a renewed, decisive push by the Japanese could still reverse everything achieved so far, while a decision to disengage would effectively end the threat. And yet neither outcome had been confirmed, leaving American commanders to operate under the assumption that the worst was still possible. The air attacks continued, the surface engagements dwindled as escorts were destroyed or withdrew, and the remaining carriers pressed on, engines straining, crews exhausted, and nerves stretched to their limits. And in this suspended moment, where survival hung on the next command issued aboard a distant flagship, the Battle off Samar hovered at the edge of catastrophe, poised at the final turning point before resolution, with the Japanese force still capable of delivering a fatal blow and the American carriers still just within reach, as the question of whether the pursuit would continue or finally break remained unanswered. As the question of whether the pursuit would continue or finally break remained unanswered, the balance tipped not with a sudden reversal, but with a sequence of decisions shaped by uncertainty, fatigue, and the accumulating cost of engagement. Because by late morning on October 25, 1944, Vice Admiral Kurita's center force was no longer operating with the clarity or cohesion required to deliver a decisive blow, and the opportunity that had appeared so starkly at dawn was already slipping away. Kurita aboard his flagship now faced a battlefield that looked increasingly dangerous and ambiguous, with American aircraft still attacking from multiple directions, reports of damage arriving from cruisers and destroyers that had been hit or forced to withdraw, and the persistent impression that the escort carriers he was chasing were only part of a larger force whose main strength had yet to reveal itself. The cumulative effect of smoke, evasive maneuvers, and air attacks had slowed his advance, stretched his formation, and eroded his confidence in the tactical picture. And although his battleships and cruisers remained overwhelmingly superior in surface firepower to anything the Americans could field, that advantage mattered less with every passing minute that failed to produce decisive results. The American carriers, though battered and scattered, were now opening the range, their slight speed advantage compounded by the Japanese loss of momentum, and Japanese gunners found it increasingly difficult to achieve accurate fire as distance grew, and targets disappeared intermittently into squalls and smoke. At the same time, Kurita had to consider his broader mission, which was not merely to destroy carriers, but to strike the invasion forces at Leyte. And the longer he remained engaged in a running battle with escort carriers, the less likely he was to reach his intended objective, particularly as fuel consumption mounted and the risk of interception by American fast carriers increased. Reports from his subordinates reflected confusion and concern, with some commanders urging continued pursuit to finish off the carriers, while others warned of the growing danger posed by air attack and the loss of formation integrity. And in this environment, decisive clarity proved elusive. Kurita ultimately made the decision to disengage, ordering his force to turn north and west, away from the fleeing carriers, a choice driven not by defeat in the conventional sense, but by a rational assessment that the risks of continued pursuit now outweighed the potential gains, especially given the uncertainty surrounding American air power and the condition of his own ships. For the American sailors of Taffy 3, this decision was not immediately apparent because Japanese ships did not vanish all at once, but gradually fell away, their fire slackening and their silhouettes receding into the distance. And it took time for Sprague and his commanders to accept that the immediate threat was ending, because the battle had taught them that assumptions could be deadly. As confirmation accumulated that Japanese ships were indeed turning away, the tension that had dominated the morning gave way to a different kind of strain, as crews confronted the damage sustained, the ships lost, and the sheer exhaustion of having survived an engagement that should, by all conventional measures, have destroyed them. The surviving escort carriers regrouped as best they could, tending to damage, recovering aircraft where possible, and sending rescue parties to pick up survivors from the water, even as the possibility of renewed attack remained in the back of every commander's mind. Overhead, American aircraft that had expended their fuel and ammunition diverted to land bases on Leyte or ditched near friendly ships, and the scale of their effort became clear only in hindsight, because while few direct hits had been achieved, their constant presence had played a decisive role in shaping Japanese perceptions and decisions. The loss of USS Gambier Bay, USS Johnston, USS Hull, USS Samuel B. Roberts, and numerous aircraft and personnel weighed heavily on the survivors. Yet these losses were now understood within the larger context of what had been prevented, because the Japanese force that had threatened to annihilate the escort carriers had been turned back, leaving the invasion beaches at Leyte intact and the broader American campaign in the Philippines unbroken. Kurita's withdrawal marked the end of the Battle off Samar as a surface engagement, though the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf continued elsewhere, and his decision would later be scrutinized and debated. But at the moment, it reflected the reality that his force, though powerful on paper, had been blunted by a combination of aggressive resistance, persistent air attack, and the fog of war. For Rear Admiral Sprague and the men of Taffy 3, the immediate aftermath involved stabilizing damaged ships, accounting for missing vessels, and preparing for the possibility of renewed action, because the war did not pause to acknowledge survival, and there was no guarantee that Japanese forces would not return. As the day progressed and the situation clarified, higher command began to understand the scale of what had occurred, recognizing that a small, lightly armed group of escort carriers and destroyers had faced and survived an engagement with the main body of the Japanese surface fleet, not through superior firepower or planning, but through endurance, improvisation, and a willingness to fight without certainty of support. The broader operational consequences were profound because the survival of Taffy 3 ensured continued air support for ground forces on Leyte, reinforced the collapse of Japanese hopes to disrupt the invasion, and underscored the declining effectiveness of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a coordinated fighting force, even when it possessed significant material strength. In the hours and days that followed, rescue operations recovered many survivors, while others were lost to the sea, and damage assessments revealed the extent to which chance, maneuver, and split-second decisions had influenced outcomes, with near misses and narrowly avoided hits making the difference between survival and destruction for several carriers. The Battle off Samar entered the historical record not as a planned stand or a calculated gamble, but as an encounter born of miscalculation on both sides, resolved through a complex interplay of perception and reality, where the belief that air support might be imminent proved as powerful as its actual presence. For the American Navy, the engagement reinforced the importance of aggressive action, initiative, and flexibility under fire, while also highlighting the risks inherent in assumptions about enemy intent and capability, lessons that would shape thinking even as the war moved toward its final phase. For the men who fought there, however, the meaning of the morning was more immediate and personal, defined by hours spent under fire, by the loss of ships and shipmates, and by the knowledge that survival had depended on decisions made without complete information, when air support was no longer certain and waiting for clarity would have meant destruction. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 resumed their mission in the days that followed, continuing to provide support for operations ashore, their decks repaired and their air groups replenished, while the names of the ships lost became part of the Navy's living memory, symbols of a battle that defied expectation and altered the course of a campaign. In the end, the Battle off Samar concluded not with a dramatic final blow, but with the quiet realization that the Japanese threat had passed, that the invasion of Leyte would continue, and that a small force, operating at the edge of its capabilities, had faced a moment of near failure and endured, shaping the outcome of the largest naval battle in history through actions taken when certainty was absent and survival depended on resolve alone.